What's up, everybody? It's just Loner Nate with Tyler. Vela?
Vela, close.
Vela. I'm getting closer. This is the second time. So,
Good there.
but yeah, welcome to Rooted in Revelation podcast, where we seek to make God's revelation our foundation in all of life. And yeah, as I just mentioned, Tyler's here with us again to talk some fun stuff. The term called Molinism, which is kind of getting into talking about God's sovereignty, human responsibility kind of talk. So yeah, Tyler, how you been? What's up, man?
Good. I'm doing pretty well. Just living the dream out here in California, and glad it's finally cooling off. So yeah.
Great. Yeah, and for those that don't, well, obviously I don't even have video, so I can't even say if you could see the video, but you can hear the audio. But Tyler is wearing a kind of passion fruit colored uh dress shirt, and I'm drinking passion fruit sparkling water. So that was pretty providential for a good discussion on sovereignty and providence and things like
I
that.
think
So
so.
yeah,
Yeah.
so God set us up good for that. But yeah, so yeah, so you introduce yourself, and then I guess how do you want to get started with this, and how do you want to introduce this, Tyler?
Yeah. Well, I think just saying what Molinism is and why it matters would be an important first kind of step, and that's because a lot of people get introduced to Molinism through apologetics, right? So through the defense of the faith, they'll listen to people like William Lane Craig, who's a pretty prominent Molinist, as well as others. If they listen to like Trinity Radio, right? Braxton Hunter's a Molinist, right? So they'll get introduced to it, and it ostensibly seeks to answer the question about the problem of evil, why is there suffering, and how humans can be responsible if God is sovereign, right? It's seeking to reconcile divine sovereignty and human freedom in a way that also at the same time they use for arguments from against the problem of evil, for example, trying to say why God allowed evil to happen in this world. So that's how it comes up. It impacts those things, and it rolls from there. And so a lot of people get exposed to Molinism from there, and on the surface it sounds great, but I found that the more you start pulling at any of the threads, the more it unravels very, very quickly. And it not only is inconsistent with Reformed theology, even though some people will say that it's not. It's inconsistent with Reformed theology, but I think at the end of the day, it's thoroughly unbiblical. So so that's why it matters. It's important to talk about.
Right. Now, is this something that's more, is there an academic, like I know you mentioned William Lane Craig, but as far as people like him, is it widely known in like scholarship, or is this just an idea that's mainly like YouTube channels and kind of your popular, podcast people and whatnot?
No, it's pretty widely known. It probably, I don't think it's the majority view among Christian philosophers. But it is probably, it's a large contingent of Christian philosophers, especially that get into the apologetics realm. It actually, there are, atheistic philosophers who talk about this, and agnostic philosophers talk about this, because in the realm of metaphysics and ethics and stuff like that, the problem of evil and freedom and responsibility, and what would happen if God exists, and you throw that all in the pot. I mean, it's a widely discussed topic. People, atheist philosophers like Alex Malpass will just to talk about it. Raviza will talk about it. So it's pretty widely well known within the philosophical literature and apologetics literature. Once you get into like Reformed theology and stuff like that, there's some interactions with it, but it's not really largely talked about unless someone is responding directly to it, because it's not a Reformed position.
Yeah, and I'm sure we'll get into all the issues with it, of course. But yeah, I was just kind of curious because listeners probably don't know. I don't know ostensibly too much about Molinism other than some James White stuff here and there. Or I think I actually listened to Paul Helm and William Lane Craig discuss it.
Yeah.
But other than those couple of things, I'm not overly familiar with them. Would you say, like, real quick, and I know we'll get more into this, but would you say this is an example of when you use philosophy in order to understand theology instead of philosophy in the service of theology? Would you say there's something there that's going on probably with something like this?
Kind of. I'm pretty hesitant to say that one side is doing philosophy and the other side isn't, right? Because I just don't intrinsically think it's wrong to use philosophy when we're doing theology. I mean, everybody does it. You have to do it to interpret the scriptures. You have to have a framework to understand even what you're reading. I mean, you have philosophical considerations when you're developing hermeneutics to even go and read the Bible. And so, I'm not entirely comfortable with being like, well, one side does philosophy and the other side doesn't. I think what happens though is that I think the Molinist, and really this, any side that affirms libertarian freedom, takes a philosophical concept that isn't rooted in the scripture, and isn't really concordant with the scripture, and they take that as a framework through which they're going to read the scripture. So they kind of go on a hunt to find it. And when you have that type of motivational bias, you're bound to find what you're looking for. It's just the question is whether that's a legitimate way to exegete the scriptures and to do hermeneutics or not. And I think it's not. So I think they do that illegitimately, whereas I think Reformed theology doesn't. And I have an article, an episode where I that's called a warranted case for biblical compatibilism. Right. So what I seek to do is to say, okay, instead of coming to the text and saying, okay, well, freedom just is, the control condition for moral responsibility, and it involves, reasons, responsiveness, and traffic control or guidance control, which is kind of the gold standard of compatibilist philosophy, and say, okay, well, that's what we mean by a robust freedom is. And so now when the Bible talks about it, I'm just going to assume that that's what the Bible means. Because that's what the libertarian does. The libertarian is going to say, okay, well, to be free just means you have to be able to have this contra-causal, ability to choose other than what you actually choose in the actual world, right? That's just what it means to be free, right? And in any other use, well, you're redefining freedom and blah, 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 right? And then they're going to go in there and say, oh, well, see, the Bible talks about people having choice, so therefore it endorses libertarian freedom. And I'm like, all you're doing is taking libertarian freedom and imposing that as the only possible concept, and you're reading it through, right? So what I do is in this article, the warranted case for biblical compatibilism is basically show, look, whatever your philosophy is, whatever you hold from the Bible, it seems like there are instances where the Bible says that a certain human action, a certain human choice is morally responsible, and yet God determined it, right? Which once you have that, you have to be some type of compatibilist, right? Because a libertarian is going to be what's called an incompatibilist. A libertarian is going to say that in principle, it can never be the case that a person is sufficiently free for moral responsibility and that their action is determined by something outside of themselves. They're say that in principle, that's incompatible, right? You cannot have that. So my argument is, whatever else you think of freedom, if I can show a single exception to that principle, if I can show a single example where someone is morally responsible for their action, and God determined it, and he is a determining factor which is outside of them, libertarianism, because it's an incompatible system, is just necessarily false, because the principle that it relies on is false. Right. So I don't need to go on and develop, and therefore Calvinism is true and stuff, but it just seems that biblical compatibilism is then there's just lots of warrant to believe that's true. And so I go through and I give a bunch of examples, right? Because there are a ton of examples that this is the case, right? So you can think of in Genesis 45, when Joseph is talking to his brothers and about selling him into slavery, and he says, "You intended it for evil, but God intended it for good." Right? Notice that the intention, the same verb is used to describe the brother's intentionality towards the action, the causal intentionality towards the action, the same action, and God's intentionality and causal action towards the same action, right? They're directly analogous. They both it's called supervene. They both of their decisions supervene and bring about the action, right? It's one action, two intending causal agents, right? And so if you have that, you just don't have incompatibilism, right? Because we don't look at it and be like, oh, well, God intended it. You know, God is a causal condition to bring it about. And so therefore the brothers aren't morally responsible. No, in the story, the brothers are clearly morally responsible, and yet God is clearly a causal determining factor in it. And so, you know, that principle just has to be false. There's Proverbs 21, where it says the king's heart is a stream of water in the hand of the Lord. He turns it wherever he wills. Right? So again, whether or not we're talking about God controlling everybody's heart, there's at least one example where it's the king's heart and his desires and choices that God turns wherever he wills. And yeah, that doesn't mean, you know, God, does that apply to King Ahaz, right? His evil actions? Yeah. What about Pharaoh? God hardened Pharaoh's heart. And you know, the whole question about who hardened it first is somewhat irrelevant, because Pharaoh was morally culpable for denying and denying the Israelites to leave, and for his additional persecution of them every time he hardened their hearts. He's morally culpable for each of those actions. And so at any point, it doesn't matter. I mean, ultimately, it doesn't matter if we're talking about compatibilism. If Pharaoh hardened his heart first, and so God's just hardening him afterwards, it doesn't matter, because God's hardening leads to Pharaoh doing evil actions towards the Israelites. And so, but we would look at him and say, okay, but Pharaoh's still responsible. We don't say that Pharaoh is only responsible for the evil actions after his initial hardening that he did to himself, if we grant that for the sake of argument. We say, no, he's morally responsible every step of the way. And yet God clearly is saying, I'm going to harden his heart so that he will not let them go. But every step of the way, Pharaoh's responsible for not letting them go. And so you have another example of compatibilism in the scriptures. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that's super interesting. I'm currently reading through Exodus right now, and I just finished the plagues. And I noticed that too, like when he promises to Moses he's going to use him and he's going to lead them out. He, you know, when the first thing he says, he's like, you know, Pharaoh's not going to let you. I'm going to harden his heart. You know what I mean? And then there's kind of that play back and forth, like Pharaoh hardens his heart, God hardens his heart, Pharaoh hard. But either way, like you're saying, it doesn't really matter, because he's held morally culpable for each time he doesn't let them go. Even though God's saying that's going to happen, and he's going to, you know, use that at the same, like, I would disagree strongly that you see this emphasis of moral culpability and God's sovereignty. And it's a sense, it's like kind of like the mysterism, or like the mystery of the Trinity. And since you can't fully comprehend what's going on, would that be kind of fair to say regarding this topic?
Yeah,
like, I mean, understand it, but not in its fullness, right?
Yeah, I don't know if I would appeal to mystery, because I think we can. I think we can say more than what I'm saying here to understand how someone can be determined yet free, right? I mean, I think something like, you know, either soft compatibilism or compatibilism under Fisher and Ravisa explains how we can have this, right? So we can talk about conditional ability and all kinds of things, right? It's all I'm saying, and I'm not right. You're gonna have some people come back and be like, oh, well, it does matter if Pharaoh hardened his heart first, or if God hardened his heart first, in the broader question about Calvinism and predestination. That's true. All I'm saying is, for the sake of this argument, for the sake of my article, that there's a biblical, you know, there's a warranted case for biblical compatibilism. All I need to show is that there are instances where someone is morally responsible, and yet there is a determinative causal factor that is outside of the agent. That's all that I need, because the instant I have that, incompatibilism is necessarily false, right? Because the incompatibilism is the principled position that something cannot be determined by outside factors and yet sufficiently free from moral responsibility, right? They're going to say that those are in principle incompatible. And if I can show one instance that they're compatible, then incompatibilism has to be false, right? So that's all that there's to that, right? So there's a bunch of other examples, but the biggest one is in Acts 2, right? It's talking about the crucifixion. And it says, speaking of Jesus, it says, this man delivered over by the predetermined plan and foreknowledge of God, you nailed to the cross by the hands of godless men and put him to death. Right? It expressly says that it was by the predetermined plan, the orizo of God, right? God ordained this, right? He brought this about. He demarcated the boundaries that this would happen. And yet clearly the evil men were culpable for the crucifixion, right? So the most evil act in history, right? So a lot of times you'll have incompatibilists come back and be like, well, that, if God ordained and predetermined, the I don't want to trigger the censors or anything like that, but like, the abuse of a small child or something like that, well, that would make God evil, right? Because that's a very emotionally driven sin. But when we look at biblically, what's the most evil thing to ever happen? Not trying to downplay the horrendous evil of things like abusing children in really disgusting ways, but the crucifixion, deicide of the second person of the Trinity, of the Son, is the most evil thing that has ever happened in all humanity, right? It clearly says that was determined, and yet they're free and morally responsible for it, right? So we have all these examples where we have compatibilism. In fact, you can look at passages like James, where it seems like we're actually supposed to live in the awareness of compatibilism, right? In James 4, he says, he says, come now, you say, today or tomorrow we will go into such and such town and spend a year there and trade and make a profit. Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, right? This is telling us how we ought to live, how we ought to plan our time. If the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that, right? As it is, you boast in your arrogance, all such boasting is evil. Notice that what he says is boasting is just saying, tomorrow we're going to go to the city, right? Tomorrow I'm going to go to the grocery store, right? He calls that boasting, right? Because it thinks that we're in control of everything that's happening, right? But it says what you should say is that tomorrow I'm going to go to the store if the Lord wills it, right? Because the Lord is going to determine what happens. It doesn't mean, right? We're not hard determinists. We're not deterministic incompatibilists. Ironically, this is a lot of the libertarians confused, and they say, oh well, that means that you have no choice. What you do doesn't matter, right? Why even pray for things, right? Because they don't understand we're compatibilists, right? Why do I go to the store tomorrow? Because I choose to go to the store tomorrow. Why do I go to the store tomorrow? Because God wills it. Both of those things are true. We're compatibilists. God's determination works via our free will choices, right? This is basic Westminster Confession, chapter 3 and chapter 5, right? So it's the free will choices of his creatures are maintained, right? So my initial reaction to Molinism, because Molinism, one of the main tenets is that it requires libertarian freedom. And we'll get into what Molinism is here in a second. But like my initial reaction to the question of who kind of imposes their philosophy on the text initially is I'm going to say, well, before I really even figure out my philosophy of the will, it just seems obvious that in the scriptures it says that things can be determined and yet free and morally responsible. Right?
Yeah. And one objection that kind of pops in my head that someone might counteract with or say back to you is like, you mentioned, you're coming to the text with certain assertions or kind of a framework, a hermeneutic by which you're understanding these texts, right? That talk about free will or God's sovereignty. And wouldn't they just come around and say the same thing? Well, you're imposing your Calvinistic or compatibilistic understanding on the text. What would you say to someone that would say something like that?
I mean, the first thing I would say is that I held these views before I was a Calvinist. So unless I can time travel, that would be amazing. So I mean, I never, I mean, I was a compatibilist before I became a Christian. So because I was a compatibilistic naturalist. So you know, it'd be somewhat surprising if it was because I was imposing Calvinism back on the text. But you know, the other thing is that, you know, that when we look at these passages, right, you'll notice when I read it, I didn't have to do anything, right? It just says God controls or determines something, and that something else is free. I'm not actually bringing any system to it, right? I'm not coming and saying, oh, well, that shows that something like, you know, reason's responsiveness and guidance control is true to make the what free will is, or that, well, that has to be conditional ability in order, you know, because if you think of like whatever. So I'm not coming and saying, well, that this is what freedom has to be, and so this is what these passages have to mean, right? I'm just looking at the passage and it says, you know, the king's heart is a stream of water in the hand, and he turns it wherever he will.
Right.
So God controls the heart and the desires of the king, but we know that the kings are morally responsible than the scriptures. So okay, both of those are true. I'm okay with that, right?
Yeah.
So like I don't have to come and be like, okay, well, when it talks about his heart, really it means like this. It means like if God is responding, or like judicial hardening. If this, like, I don't have to read all that other stuff in the text. This is what it says, right? You know, I don't have to, when it says that it came about by the predetermined and definite foreknowledge of God. I don't have to go and just do like crazy hula hoops and you know, gymnastics to get around. That's just what the text says, right? I don't have to make it mean something else. I don't have to try to soften the terms. I don't have to try to make them mean something outside of the normal lexical range of these terms throughout the rest of the scripture, right? It's just what it says. You know, I do a very similar thing when reading through other passages. I did a whole, you know, thing reading through like the cage stage chapter, Romans 9. And I went through it and I was like, look, like, here's literally what it says. I'm not doing any theologizing. I'm not doing any philosophizing. This is just basic discourse analysis. I'm not saying Calvinism is true, right? This is just what basic, you know, even what we did in philosophical studies when we do discourse analysis. This is just, you know, I'm not doing any type of theologizing based on it, right? But I don't have to do all these other somersaults to fit a certain theology into it. I just don't.
Yeah, that's helpful. Like, sorry, one more thing I'm gonna come at you with.
Yeah.
Well, what about, like, you know, when people are just, well, for God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that whoever so believes in him. Like, you know, what if they come at you with that same kind of like, well, this is just what it says. This is what it says. Or, you know, God wishes that none will perish, but all will come to repentance. Well, that's just what it says. That's what it says. So obviously it means everyone. Like, you know what I mean? Like, what would you do with something like that if they come back with that?
Yeah, I agree with what it says. So like someone who brings up John 3:16, you know, for God so loved the world, he gave his whoever son, that whoever believes. Okay. Now what? Like, yes, God so loved the world that he gave his son so that whosoever believes. I don't even need to go. I mean, I could go and be like, so that the believing ones, right? I mean, we could do that, but there's, in order for them to get to, therefore, right? Because normally John 3:16 comes up when we're talking about limited atonement. So therefore, Jesus died for everybody. I'm looking at, okay, I mean, that's nowhere in the text, right? It doesn't say that therefore Jesus died for everybody in the text, right? You're extrapolating something out of it, right? So in order to get there, so I normally ask them, can you connect the dots for me? Because I don't see it, right? God so loved the world, yeah, that he gave his only son, yeah, so that whosoever believes, yeah, anyone that believes shall not perish but have everlasting life. Perfect. That's fine. Cool. Right?
And that would be why you're compatibilist, right? I mean, it balances the human responsibility and God's sovereignty equally, so that they both make perfect sense.
Right.
So it's not like, you know, you're a fatalist or something, like, you know, we're all just robots. So, and then you would, on the hyper Calvinistic side or a hyper sovereign side, you would have that kind of maybe similar to libertarian free will, where you're trying to explain why it means something more than it's saying, or something less
Yeah.
than it's saying, right?
Well, the funny thing is, I mean, hyper Calvinists. So we really should get into Molinism eventually, but this is interesting.
Oh yeah,
right? So libertarianism is a view that you are at liberty, that's where it comes from, to choose something other than what you choose and what philosophers call the actual sequence of events. What happens in the actual world, you have this contra-causal, ability of contradiction, categorical ability. There's a bunch of different terms for it. You have this ability to actually choose other than the thing you chose in the actual world, all things being equal. No change whatsoever, right? That you have this thing, there's what's called the principle of alternative possibility. You could have chosen otherwise, all things being equal, right? And they're incompatibilists. They're going to say the instant there's anything that determines your choice that you don't yourself have control over to choose, then you are not free in a sense that you're morally responsible. The instant there is any type of determining factor outside of something you are directly choosing for yourself, you're no longer sufficiently free, right? They're incompatibles, right? So they're going to say any type of that determinism is incompatible. But they're going to say, but you are free, but we do have these principles, alternative possibilities. The hyper Calvinist is a deterministic incompatibilist. They agree that the instant there is any type of determining factors, you're no longer sufficiently free. They're just going to say it just is the fact that you're not sufficiently free. To hell with moral responsibility. If God says he wants to judge you, he can judge you whether you're morally responsible or not, right? They're fatalists, right? This is why when you know, people like Flowers and others say, oh, well, Calvinists are just fatalists. No, we're not. We're not fatalists, right? Because we believe that your choices matter to the outcome. They are the means that bring about the outcome. They matter. Only on incompatibilism does choices not matter to the outcome, because the choices aren't determinative of the outcome. Something outside is the sole determining factor of the outcome, right? So we're not fatalists, right? So ironically, the hyper Calvinist and the libertarian are far closer to each other than the compatibilist is, right? So because they're both incompatibilists.
Right. No, that's great. Thanks for saying all that stuff. That's really helpful. So Tyler, you know, what's Molinism? Maybe we should get going in that direction so we don't get caught in the age-old Arminian Calvinist dialogue. But
yeah. So Molinism is historically in kind of the realm of classical theism. There are what are considered two moments of God's knowledge, right? So when we think about omniscience, what does God know? There's these two ideas of God's knowledge. There's his natural knowledge and his free knowledge, right? His natural knowledge is his knowledge about himself, right? His necessary knowledge, and his knowledge about all things, all logically possible things, basically, right? A knowledge of all things before creation. His free knowledge is his knowledge about the actual world that he has chosen, right? So prior to creation, it's his knowledge of what will be, right? So a lot of people will say his natural knowledge is his knowledge of himself and what could be, all possibilities. His free knowledge is his knowledge of what will be, for sure, right? That's what he's going to create. The Molinist is going to come along and say, okay, but there's this thing called middle knowledge, right? It kind of sits in between those things. And it's his knowledge of what could be, right? They're going to say this is God's knowledge about what free creatures could do in given circumstances, right? Not all the possible, logically possible things, because some of those might not be feasible, which we can talk about. Not what will be the case in the actual world, but all of these things that could be the case. God knows all of what we could choose. And from there, God actualizes one of those worlds, right? So that's called middle knowledge. And then they're going to say, well, that's based on really these things called counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, which really isn't a good term for it, because I'm a compatibilist and I believe that there are counterfactuals of creaturely freedom because I'm a compatibilist. I don't deny freedom. I deny libertarian freedom, but I don't deny freedom, right? So we can get into some of these definitional problems, right? So they're going to say that those are kind of the two pillars of Molinism, that God has this knowledge of what could be, and that God actualizes his world based on those situations, and that's based on libertarian freedom, right? There are so many problems with this view in how it works out, right? We can get to some of it. One of my main issues, though, is that I think it creates a problem that doesn't exist, right? Because they want to say that you need this middle knowledge in order for God to know all of these counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, right? And they're going to want to say, well, if you deny middle knowledge, then you're denying that God can know all of these counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, right? And I'm just, right? So they think they're solving a problem. I'm saying, okay, well, that's just a problem that isn't worth solving, because on a reformed view, part of God's natural knowledge is that whatever God would decree to create would be actual, right? And if God has this natural knowledge of all possible things, a subset of that would be all of the worlds that God could decree, right? So God could have the knowledge, if I decreed world 1, world 2, right? All of these counterfactual worlds, then Tyler would do A in this world, or Tyler would do B in this world, right? All you have to do is say, God has all these counterfactuals. He just knows them contingently upon what he could do, right? Right. And so he has all this exhaustive counterfactual, right? So Molinism kind of creates this problem that doesn't exist, right? You don't need to invent this whole third type of knowledge, right? The Reformed person would just say, okay, but all that's just subsumed under God's natural knowledge. That already exists in God's natural knowledge. You don't need to break it out as this third thing. And so we would deny that, typically, historically in Reformed theology, we would just deny that middle knowledge is a thing. We just deny that it's a meaningful category. It's just describing a subset that already exists in God's natural knowledge. But in breaking it out, it causes a bunch of problems, a bunch of theological problems. For example, when you break it out into middle knowledge, right, there's this thing called a grounding objection, right? The question becomes, if God's decree, if God as the creator, the founder of all things, the one who upholds all things by the power of his word, is not the truth maker for those counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, then what is, right? And they're going to say, oh, well, it's the person's libertarian freedom choice. God just knows what they would freely choose. The question is, but they don't exist apart from God. So if they don't exist apart from God, but somehow they exist, kind of quote unquote exist prior to creation, they conceptually exist to make these free choices, how does God know what those free choices will be? Because the truth makers for those haven't been created by God. So something else is there. So right? So you have this grounding problem that comes up. So it's not entirely clear how God would even have this middle knowledge, how he would know it, because nothing exists for him to know about those states of affairs, but nothing that exists is the truth maker for those states of affairs. So how do they have a truth value for him to even know it? Right. So you get this grounding problem for God's knowledge. And there's actually, that's one type of grounding objection. There's like a dozen different ways this grounding objection can be run. Right. That's one of them. Another problem, and this is one of the ones that I find very problematic, is that it seems to deny the aseity of God. Right. Because it seems to say that God's knowledge in some way is contingent upon something else outside of himself, right? Because God only knows, if the libertarian freedom, even if you ignore the grounding objections, if the libertarian freedom of the creature is the truth maker, is the determining truth maker for the choices, right? And God hasn't decreed it. God's not the creator of that. God's not the determiner of that. Then that means something outside of God. God knows it because something else is making it true. But that just means there's a whole category of knowledge, right? That God has contingently upon something else, right? Which at this point, I don't know how any Molinist can affirm that God is aseity, right? That God has, that there's the aseity of God, right? Because that just means God is contingent upon something else.
That's exactly like when you're starting to explain it, that was like the immediate thought I just was having, because I'm like, isn't this kind of placing something upon God, like some kind of law over God's, infiniteness, whatever, aseity, right?
Yeah.
It's like, to me, it's just like another problem. Like, why would God be under some outside standard that would control how he's going to function and make decisions?
Right.
Like, to me, I'm just like, nah, I don't see how that would work out. Obviously it doesn't, but like, just even hearing you just bringing it up, I'm like, well, like you just mentioned, they're creating like problems that don't really exist and then finding solutions to them. And I'm just like, doesn't even seem like an issue.
Yeah, there's all kinds of and they try to come up with creative solutions, but to me they all feel very ad hoc. So there's literally like dozens and dozens and dozens, I think, of problems that Molinism rises, and sometimes they'll start inventing things like transworld depravity and transworld damnation, and now you have to get into transworld righteousness and all kinds of just these weird things to try to explain all this stuff. But it's like, none of that's in the scripture, and there are like you're basically having to create all these ad hoc fixes for problems that Molinism creates, that like if you just stick to like classic Reformed theology, like we just don't have those problems, right? It's so much cleaner and simpler, and you're creating problems to solve, right? And one of my like the things I think is the biggest irony of it is you start getting into kind of an explanatory loop, right? Explanatory loops are so imagine that I had $1 million in my bank account, right? And I was able to use that $1 million to create a time machine, right? And I traveled back in time so that I invested, a year ago in Doge, $1,000. So I became a millionaire. So I had the $1 million in my bank account in the future to create the time machine, right? You get in this little explanatory loop, right? Which most philosophers find a major problem with, right? You can't have that type of internal explanatory loop in a coherent system, right? Something has to explain something else, and something can't explain the thing needed to explain itself, right? You have these problems. So here's the question. On Molinism, the libertarian free choice of the creature is known to God prior to the foundation of the world to know what they would do in any given circumstance, right? So that middle knowledge. God, based on his middle knowledge, acts and decrees and creates a certain world, right? Let's call it W1. So W1 becomes the actual world that God creates, right? Now, we have to think about this as an Orthodox Christian, because the question isn't, right, that maybe it's the case that Molinism is true and Christianity is false, right? Maybe. But I mean, there are other objections to that, but I think we want to say, okay, but we're all Christians. Let's try to maintain that. Let's, see how that goes, right? So so God actualizes this world, right? We want to maintain, unless you're, an open theist, and even open theists don't want to admit this, we want to maintain that God is omniscient and that God is infallible, right? Even the open theists want to admit that, right? They don't want to say that God can err and he can be wrong in his knowledge, right? If the open theist wants to say, at least, the ones that want to pretend to be Orthodox, they want to say that what God knows, when God knows it, that actually is infallible. It cannot be false, right? So here's the question. In the actual world, right? Let's say that God knows at a certain time tomorrow, I'm going to make a certain decision X, right? It's not possible for God to be wrong. It cannot be the case that God's going to be wrong. Otherwise, we don't have anything like biblical Christianity at that point, right? So it cannot be the case that God can be wrong, right? Tomorrow, at the time of making the choice, so God knows that I'm going to choose X tomorrow at that certain time. Is it possible for me to choose not X, something else besides X, right? The answer seems obviously no, because if I could choose something else, well, that something else just is what would falsify God's knowledge. But we've already said God's knowledge can't be falsified. So in principle, it's not even possible that it be possible that I choose something else, right? But if I don't have the ability to choose otherwise, and I don't have this principle of alternative possibilities, then I don't have libertarian freedom, right? So in the actual world, when I make the decision, I don't have libertarian freedom to choose X, which means in the situation where I choose X, I didn't do it libertarianly free, right? So, but I needed to choose it as libertarianly free so that God would know it in the past as a libertarianly free choice, right? So you get this weird little explanatory loop that in order for me to have libertarian freedom, the act itself has to not be libertarianly free in order to be concrete enough for it to be a true thing that God can know, that it causally allows him to know it in the past as a libertarianly free choice. So you get this impossible causal loop, right? Explanatory loop, right? Which is just utterly incoherent. And if you think about it, also what it entails is that Molinism starts with the presumption of libertarian freedom of human agents and ends with something like compatibilistic determinism.
That's what I was thinking, yeah.
So it says by assuming that libertarianism is true, it entails that libertarianism is false, which just is an incoherent position, right? So and I'm just scratching the surface. Like there are so many problems with this view. This is just one of the big ones, right? This is just one of the more obvious ones. But there are so many like this, where it may be the case, right, that someone like like an open theist who's basically I say they basically worship like a mega Zeus. They don't worship, the God of historic Christianity, right? Maybe someone like that, maybe someone who holds a pagan worldview, right, or a polytheistic worldview or something, maybe they could be Molinists, right? But anyone who holds an orthodox understanding as God, having the omni attributes, being the creator of this world, the sustainer of all things, it's just if you put Molinism on that, you just entail all of these contradictions.
You mentioned open theism. For my listeners that might not be aware of what that is, what's open theism real quick?
There are different kinds of open theism. Open theism is basically the view that God doesn't know the future, right? God doesn't know the future is open, right? It's non-determined, because they're hard libertarian incompatibilists. They're going to say that because in order for a free choice to be free, it cannot be determinate, right? You cannot have determinate causes. That means that before an action, there's nothing that determines it prior in the causal chain. And so if nothing's determinate, that means at the time of choosing, we really could choose A or not A, X or not X, right? I really could choose vanilla ice cream or not vanilla ice cream. But if that's the case, it's indeterminate. It means it's not that God, they're going to say, well, God's omniscient. God knows all possible things. It's just that like future free actions just aren't things to know yet. There's no truth value to them yet. And so God doesn't know them. Again, they're going to say that's not a deficiency in God's knowledge, because God knows everything that can be known. They're just going to say, well, that's just something that can't be known. Well, I mean, if that's the case, right, I'm not sure how you're a Molinist then, because God wouldn't even have middle knowledge, because middle knowledge just is, God could know. It's this weird thing, right? They could say that God has middle knowledge. He knows all the possibilities of the dice roll, right? but he can't have any future. Like, he rolls the dice and a world actualizes, but he can't know the future in that actual world because the events are indeterminate. Does that make sense? So the future in the actual world is open even to God, and so he does the best that he can.
So would that make God as someone like he's learning as it goes along? So he has present knowledge, but not future knowledge or middle knowledge.
Yep. And so there's philosophical open theists that don't tend to try to even be biblical. They don't really care. They have other issues. But then you have, people who like more of a Grew and some others, Will Duffy, others who the biggest scholar for them is Greg Boyd. Right? They're going to at least try to be biblical somewhat, although they usually have terrible hermeneutics. They usually affirm some type of process theology. There's all kinds of problems that go along with it, but they're going to try to be biblical and say, well, God knows all possible things. He just doesn't know these future, but he's a really, 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 really good guesser.
And that's what makes him actually really powerful, right? Because
really powerful.
Yeah, really special and way cooler than we want to put him in a box about, right?
Clearly,
yeah. And then and obviously, so would Molinists use similar like proof text, like as far as I think of when it's when after the fall happens, it says Lord's walking in the garden, he says, Adam, where are you? It's like, does he really mean where are you? Or would they kind of use that language, or God changed his mind about, or like when Abraham's going back and forth, like if there's 50 righteous, 40 righteous, 30 righteous, will you not destroy Sodom and Gomorrah? And God's like, no, if there's 5, it's almost kind of like it's like a debate. Like God's like, maybe I'll change my mind about judging these people or destroying these people. Would Molinists and open theists use that, or just open?
Just open theists. The Molinists, like Braxton Hunter and Tim Stratton, they're going to want to affirm that God has exhaustive foreknowledge.
Right. Okay. That's what I thought. That's what I was just curious if there's any form that would.
So the Molinist, though, is going to appeal to. They have very few biblical passages to appeal to. They typically they'll typically use the very bad argument where they say, okay, well, we see libertarian freedom throughout the entire Bible, right? And they'll point to any Bible verse that talks about where someone's making a choice, right? The choice is before you this day, choose life and not death, right? See, libertarian freedom, right? Okay, no. All that does is show that we have substantive choice. Compatibilism, that's just as much. But the libertarians can say, oh, well, we don't think compatibilism gets that, so it has to be libertarian. And my comeback is, okay, all you've done, though, is say that this passage proves libertarianism if you presuppose libertarianism, right? So if you presuppose compatibilism doesn't work and is in false, then this passage about choice is about libertarianism. Therefore, this passage shows libertarianism. That's just circular reasoning, right? It begs the question, and it's circular reasoning. It's just a terrible way to try to prove the scriptures, right? So all the most you can get from the scriptures is that these passages on choice show that we have real substantive choice, right? It doesn't give them metaphysics about whether it's compatibilist or incompatibilist besides. You need other things to do that.
And no compatibilist is denying that we have moral culpability.
That's right. Yep. Yeah. So, but what the Molinist is going to do to try to show Molinism is they're going to go to the handful of passages that seem to show that God has this thing called this counterfactual knowledge of what could be if circumstances were different, right? So they're going to look at like passages like Matthew 11, right? So Matthew 11 says, Jesus is talking, and he says, "Woe to you, Chorazin! Woe to you, Bethsaida! For if the miracles that were performed to you had been performed in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes." Right? Counterfactual knowledge. If this thing had been different, then they would have repented. And God knows that. Right? And they're going to say, see, middle knowledge. Right? Well, what's the comeback? We're going to come and say, okay, all that shows is that God has counterfactual knowledge. But if you remember back to what we were saying earlier, well, all that means is God knew what it would have been if he had decreed a different world, right, than the actual world, right? If he had decreed the actual sequence to be different, lo and behold, the actual sequence would have been different. And that's if we even, okay, that's the harder response, not harder as in it's more difficult, but that's the stronger response, right? We could just look at it and be like, I mean, it's just hyperbolic language. I could literally say, had the miracles happened to my pet dog, even my pet dog would have repented, right? Because clearly Jesus is saying, hey, you guys are so blind and so crazy that even if this ridiculously sinful people had seen the miracles, they would have repented. What the hell is the matter with you guys? Literally, right? Mm-hmm. The same effect would have been, even if I did this for my dog, he would get it, right? So when we look at the language, it's probably just hyperbole. It's not trying to give this like deep philosophical metaphysics of counterfactual. I mean, come on, like Jesus is using hyperbole to condemn people, right? So that's one of them. The other one is, the other big one is in 1 Samuel 23, when David is asking the Lord about, it's basically a military, what will happen, right? David speaking says, will the citizens of Keilah surrender me to him? Will Saul come down as your servant has heard? Lord God of Israel, tell your servant, right? David's asking, what will happen if I do this certain thing? And the Lord said, he will. And David asked, will the citizens of Keilah surrender me and my men to Saul? And the Lord said, they will. So David and his men, about 600 in number, left Keilah and kept moving from place to place, right? So he basically says, like, if we do this thing, what's going to happen? He said, okay, well, the citizens are going to basically turn you over to Saul, right? So David ends up not doing that thing, right? And goes somewhere else, right? And so the Molinism is going to say, see, counterfactual knowledge, right? Middle knowledge, Molinism, clear as day in the scripture, right? Whereas we're going to come back and be like, yeah, if God had decreed the conditions of the world to be different, then the conditions of the world would be different. Natural knowledge, right? Like, yeah. No, there's just no conflict there, right? Unless you take Molinism and say, we're going to beg the question that the only way God can have counterfactual is if Molinism is true, then we're going to look at this passage and say, see, it shows Molinism, therefore the Bible supports Molinism. All you've done is say, if Molinism is true, then the Bible shows Molinism is true, therefore Molinism is true. But that's your assumption. You went in assuming that Molinism is true. That just is to reason in a circle. It's just a terrible way to try to interpret these passages. It's just entirely unreasonable. So when I look at, when I look at that, there's really absolutely no biblical warrant for Molinism, right? I just don't see it anywhere, right? At best, we can say that the scriptures are underdeterminative for the truth of middle knowledge and counterfactual. Although, again, that's just ignoring the warranted case for biblical compatibilism that I gave already.
Yeah. So that would be like, so we look at the same text and be like, well, they would still affirm what we're saying without having to say what you're saying.
That's right.
Basically, right? What's and looking at this other one, Deuteronomy 31:16-17. Are you aware of that one? It is
the secret things.
No, hang on. It's
31,
in that day they will say, have not these troubles come upon us because our God is not in our midst. Deuteronomy 31:16-17. Unless this thing is taking it to the wrong place. Hang on. It says where God tells Moses that the Israelites will forsake God after they are delivered from Egypt. I'm sorry. That's about foreknowledge. I'm sorry. I didn't read the beginning sentence. I just did what they did. I read something out of context. Sorry.
That's all right. That's right.
It was something about counterfactual stuff about it was related to Matthew 23 or 11.
Yeah, I mean, it could go into questions about the nature of freedom and free will and all that kind of stuff, but it's not I was gonna say, I don't think that's one of the proof texts that try to show middle knowledge in Molinism, right?
Yeah,
So, yeah. So yeah. So I mean, that's one of the, you know, I don't think that that Molinism has any biblical text to support it whatsoever.
Okay. A while back, I saw William Lane Craig. I think it was a Reasonable Faith video. And they went to, I think one of the verses they used was, maybe it was Acts 17. Is that possible? Where it talks about how God knows where all people will be and live. See, maybe I'm getting what they would say the middle knowledge and foreknowledge. Maybe I'm thinking more of how they would view foreknowledge, which would be pretty similar. Like, would they say, so how would they view foreknowledge then? Would that be like them saying God sees all the possible worlds, but goes with...
So this is where it gets into the grounding objection, right? How does God have foreknowledge, right? Because, you know, again, when you're talking to Molinists, we want to be charitable, right? Tim Stratton, you know, Keith. I don't think Keith Lee's an open theist. You know, I don't think there are a bunch that are trying to be orthodox, right? They're not going to be open theists, right? So they're not going to be reformed. So they're not going to have like a decree basis for their knowledge. So they'll usually hold one of two views, right? One of them is just a simple foreknowledge view. It just is a brute fact that God knows these things, and, you know, screw you and your grounding objections, right? That's essentially what it is. Or they're going to be like a prescience view, where God somehow, right there, it's kind of hard to explain. They're going to say, well, God just observes all the future facts, right? They're not going to say, they don't like that whole he looks down the corridors of time, whatever. But somehow God has this prescience. He has this ability to see all the future facts and potential future facts and stuff like that. And so that's how God has his foreknowledge. There are a bunch of other problems with that, but so they're typically going to hold one of those views. Most Molinists I talk to, I think, have a simple foreknowledge view, although there are some that hold kind of a prescience view.
So where would you say Molinism ends up kind of leading to? Obviously, it's inconsistent. It's kind of, like you mentioned, the looping theme that it seems to have, where it proves and denies itself in one big circle almost.
Yeah, well, there are lots of problems, right? So let me actually describe one more, because it's one of my favorite ones, because, you know, I was slightly prophetic. So when I first started learning about Molinism and reading it back in, I don't know, 2009, 2010, right? So you have to remember, part of what Molinism says is that God takes it. Part of God's natural knowledge is he knows all logically possible worlds, right? But they're going to say, well, not every logically possible world is a feasible world for God to create, right? There's a whole bunch of problems that comes with that, a whole bunch of objections that come with that maneuver. But they're going to say his middle knowledge is of counterfactuals of creaturely freedom in feasible worlds, in worlds that God could actually create. So maybe it's the case that there's a bunch of logically possible worlds about tomorrow, what I would choose at a certain time. Maybe I'll choose to quack like a duck. Maybe I'll choose to eat a pile of poop. Maybe I'll choose, right? There's all these logically possible worlds, but there's no world in that situation where I would actually, or where I would ever choose any of those things. And so there maybe is this limited range of choices that I would ever make in any world that God could create, right? So they're going to say maybe, you know, of all these feasible worlds, right? And then God basically chooses from those feasible worlds the world that he wants to actualize and interact with to bring about his purposes. When I first started reading this, I was like, well, I mean, that's just going to lead to things like gratuitous evil, right? Because maybe it's the case that there's no possible world, there's no feasible world where people are sufficiently free in a libertarian sense, where God can use God can bring about all his purposes from every single free action. So maybe it's the case that there really are evils that have non-redemptive value to them, right? Because God's just kind of, uses the card that he's dealt. Maybe of all the feasible worlds, there's no world that contains 100% of things that God could use for redemptive, to bring about redemption, right? That whole kind of God works all things together for the good of those who love him. Maybe there's no possible world where that's the case. There's no feasible world where that's the case, right? And it seems to me that what's entailed by this is that the Molinists might be stuck saying, when we say, okay, why is there all of this apparently gratuitous evil in the world, right? It may be the case that the Molinist is stuck trying to resolve the problem of gratuitous suffering by saying, well, God did the best he could with the cards he was dealt, right? So maybe there is no morally sufficient reason for this specific instance of evil, but this world on a whole is the best world that God could actualize of the feasible world, right? And I was like, that seems like a really big problem for Molinism. And I was like, oh, that you don't understand Molinism. No one says that, all this kind of stuff. Lo and behold, in like 2017, right, Kirk McGregor, one of the biggest Molinists that's out there, literally wrote the biography of Louis de Molina, which is, by the way, where the term Molinism comes from, part of the Counter-Reformation, which people sometimes forget that Molinism came out of the Counter-Reformation. Anyways, Kirk McGregor basically came out and said, yeah, gratuitous evils, that seems to be entailed by Molinism, right? And a bunch of other Molinists have started following suit, right? So that to me is a huge problem. Like how is it that you can be a Molinist where it seems to entail that there's gratuitous evil that God does not bring about redemption or good from, and yet say that you believe the scriptures where it says God works all things together for the good of those who love him and called according to his purpose, right? Yeah. Right. So you have those types of problems that come up as well.
Yeah. And then immediately after you kind of those conclusions, you obviously will have to start doing what you mentioned earlier, kind of jumping jacks a bit, and you start coming up with all these weird new terms. Like, what was the one? Trans
world depravity means that any possible world, these person, right? It starts getting weird. Like it starts turning into like, so basically what has happened a lot of times in a Molinism is you start getting, when God is trying to decide who to create and how to create people, he basically, it almost turns into like this weird, like, I think it's Jehovah's Witnesses that have like the soul bank that God can draw from, right? You start getting into this thing of like, you have these essences, right? They're not actually persons yet. They have no attributes, but some of them are trans world depraved, that any possible world, they would be depraved in any world you put them in. Other ones are trans world righteous. They would be righteous and believe in God in any possible world you put them in. Some are, some aren't. Some kind of depends on what world you put them in. And God kind of takes these things and adds personal attributes to them and starts putting them in context. He like has these little like puzzle pieces, like these little. You start getting into these weird metaphysics to try to rescue Molinism. That's why it's kind of funny when they say, oh well, Reform people are like reading their philosophy and doing all these philosophical jumping jacks. They're reading in the text. And I'm gonna be like, dude, you've literally gotten to the point where your metaphysics need this like soul bank of nondescript attributes with things like trans world depravity and trans world damnation and trans world righteousness and like, no, like, I'm sorry, we're not the ones that are doing all the weird philosophizing. I mean,
yeah, that's. Man, that sounds like like one of them weird movies, like The Island or something, or like when you're like, that's so weird.
And it's not all Molinist, right? I don't want to make it sound like that is what that's Molinism, Molinism, but they're really going that way to try to get around a bunch of these objections, right? And people don't realize this, right? It's not like their objections to Molinism. I'm doing this because I'm reformed, right? You have so many people objecting to Molinism, right? You have other libertarians that are objecting Molinism. You have other incompatibilists, sourcehood incompatibilists like Kevin Tempe, who object to Molinism. You have atheistic philosophers like Fisher that object to Molinism, not on theological grounds, not because he's an atheist, but because so Fisher is a philosopher of action. So literally a philosopher of the nature of the will, right? He objects to it on grounds of, well, that's just a dumb, not, I mean, he's not going to say that harsh, but that's a problematic understanding of how the will functions. And I mean, it's just, you have all of these people that are giving these objections to it. This isn't like, I'm not actually saying anything that really is exclusively reformed as an objection to Molinism.
Mm-hmm. So is this all part of the plan to save libertarian free will? Like just in a differing kind of trying to deal with sovereignty and human responsibility?
It's trying to deal with sovereignty and human responsibility within the context of the problem of evil. It always, when you scratch a Molinist, they bleed problem of evil, right? They're very concerned about solving the problem of evil. They're trying to rescue God's character. They're trying to rescue, God out of the problem of evil. The funny thing is, and I point this out to, I mean, this isn't just Molinists. I point this out to anyone who tries to use the free will defense or a free will theodicy, is that even if their view is true, it doesn't solve the problem of evil. Because in the philosophy of action, there is a distinction between free will, freedom of the will, and outcome. Right? So imagine I freely choose to pick up my pen, right? There is my free will decision to pick up my pen, and then there's the outcome of me actually picking up my pen, right? Mm-hmm. It could be, and so you have all these, well, God has to allow suffering because in order for people to be free, they have to be able to choose to do evil actions. Okay, think about that for a second. God could entirely maintain free will. He could block action, right? So imagine that God never intervenes to ever stop anybody from pointing a gun at someone and pulling the trigger, right? But what God could do is make it a law of nature that any object hurled at another person with malintent to cause harm will turn into a marshmallow, right? I know that sounds silly, but it proves the point that God, the freedom of the will doesn't actually explain why God allows the outcome of evil, right? Why is it that there are children who are abused, sexually abused in certain ways, right? Is it just because of the freedom of choice? Not only is that kind of problematic, because then, well, you have God basically saying, well, I'm going to uphold the freedom of the abuser, but not the freedom of the victim, right? It doesn't have the recourse of the morally sufficient reason of God's divine providential plan, like Reformed theology does, right? It just for some reason, freedom is such a good that evil, God doesn't step in and stop it. But when you think about it, the abuser could literally freely choose to do that act, and God could still prevent the outcome of the act, right? So the freedom of the choice actually doesn't explain the evil outcome. So at the end of the day, even if Molinism were true, even if libertarian freedom were true, even if these things were true, they don't actually answer the problem of evil, right? Because they don't actually answer why God allows the outcome or decrees the outcome or permits the outcome or learns that the outcome will happen and does nothing about it. Whatever theological system it is, right? Even if libertarian freedom is true, Molinism is true, it doesn't answer the question. And so they go through all these somersaults, and they go through all this philosophizing, and they invent this whole third category of knowledge, and they have this view that assumes libertarian freedom, but entails compatibilism, entails some type of determinism, right? All these kinds of problems to solve the problem of evil in a way that doesn't even solve the problem of evil. So why go through all of that when you could just take the much simpler answer and just go with a reformational decretal view, and you're all set, right? You don't need to go through all of that nonsense.
That's so true, because I often see like a more Arminian or Molinist take on the problem of evil always seems to be like, God's not the, author is saying God's, what kind of wicked God would that be if he ordained the evil that would come to pass, et cetera, et cetera. But it's like, well, you have a God that allows it. And that's, actively just turning his head when evil things happen.
Right.
And in other words, it's saying they're in the same predicament. But what we
Yeah.
want to see, what's the most biblical take on
Yeah.
this? How do we best understand this?
Yeah. So I again going back to the crucifixion, right? I normally look and say, okay,
Yeah.
What is the crucifixion in these different views, right? In Reformed theology, God determined and decreed it, and yet the people who brought it about are morally responsible, and God gets glory out of it.
Yeah.
Right. We don't look at it and be like, well, that makes God disgusting, right? That makes God a moral monster. Right? No, we understand that God is creator, that God is righteous, that whatever he decrees and brings about, he is just in doing so, and that he'll bring all things together for the good of those who love him or called according to purpose. And we understand all those categories. In philosophy, we would call those morally sufficient reasons. Right? And God is of such a righteous standing that he can bring good even out of evil, right? Without himself being evil. That's just the biblical view of God, I think. It is what it is. Again, the incompatibilists can say, well, we don't think that's true. That's fine. We think it is true. So if you're going to critique it, you need to do an internal critique and critique our view of it, right? You can't say, well, that makes God evil. Well, no, it would only be evil if you assume incompatibilism is true and God still forces us to do those evil as he is the causal agent. That would make God evil, I think. But that's not our view, right? That's you assuming incompatibilism to be true. That's not our view, right? So what is it on the non-Calvinist view? Or really the non-Augustinian view? What is it, right? Well, God wants to protect the libertarian freedom. He didn't decree the abuse of the child. He didn't decree or determine the crucifixion, but he allowed it to happen. Why? The instant they appeal to any morally sufficient reason, he's going to bring good out of it, he has a better plan, it reduces the amount of evil, whatever it is, they've given the exact answer that we say that God has determined it. Right? God has determined it for those morally sufficient reasons is no different than God has allowed it for those morally sufficient reasons. Right? What makes it different that God, the abuser is abusing the child, God could stop. When we think about the objection, God didn't. If God determined it, it makes God evil, because God wouldn't want that to happen. Okay, on your view, God didn't want it to happen. He could have stopped it, but he didn't stop it. How is that better than the righteous judge and creator of all the universe can, for his plan and purpose, bring about whatsoever comes to pass in a righteous and holy way? How is your view better? It's not. It's just when you start using even like a modicum of reason, when you start thinking about these objections, it just doesn't work. They just don't work.
Yeah. I mean, thanks for reaffirming my own view, but
well, you also have lots of other problems, right? I mean,
yeah.
you have problems like, I mean, the scripture tells us that God upholds all things by the power of his word. All things. That means everything that exists, he upholds, he exerts his power to uphold it. Right? Think about that for a second. What does the non-Calvinist have to do then? Right? The Calvinists say, whatever comes to pass, God has determined, right? God is the creator of all things. It doesn't mean that God's the morally responsible agent. But if someone murders someone, guess what? That falls under all things. God upholds it by the power of his word. That means God is actively upholding. He's exerting power such that it exists. If God didn't do that, it wouldn't exist. Right? God is the creator and the sustainer of all things, who upholds all things by the power of his will, or power of his word. Right? So go to the other side. Right? They have to say that even though the scripture says God upholds all things by the power of his world, or by the power of his word, he didn't want this to happen, and somehow it exists apart from him upholding it by the power of his word, even though it says all things. So they have to then go back and be like, okay, well, all doesn't mean all, right? Which goes against all their other rhetoric, right? So
which is usually what they say we do,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
That we make all doesn't mean all. You know, you guys have to mess with it. Yeah, that's kind of interesting. It's a similar objection. Continue. Sorry.
That's where I was at. I mean,
Oh, okay. Yeah.
you have not only that it's a bigger problem on their view, but that it actually undermines their view, and you have these scriptures that directly contradict their position,
Yeah.
right? All in service of them saying, yeah, but Calvinism we think is yucky, because if we beg the question that
And
Calvinism
that's ultimately what it comes down to. It seems like,
well,
it's
yeah,
just, we don't like it.
If we beg the question that Calvinism is false, then look how false Calvinism is.
Yeah.
Okay, well then don't beg the question and be reasonable, right? So
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, even in Ephesians 1, it says that God works all things according to the counsel of his will.
Yep.
You know, I think the Westminster Confession which one is it? I'm learning them right now because I'm going to be teaching some high school stuff. So I'm trying to memorize. I got to memorize all 107 catechism questions and answers. The shorter.
I have a project coming out that you will love.
What, a memorization thingy?
I'm coming out with an audio version, so because there are actually versions of the catechism where it's just you just listen to it, but you just listen to it straight. It's just like reading a book, an audio book. I have one that is actually structured for memorization.
That would be great.
Yeah.
When's that coming?
I'm still working on it.
Hurry up.
Maybe not in time. Maybe not in time for this. Maybe I'll let you you be one of my, I'll give it to you for free and let you be one of my testers.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah, I'll give you another opportunity to come on again or something.
Yeah.
You know, that's it, because that would cost hundreds to come on here, you know. And so that's a great deal for you, you know. No, but yeah, yeah, that's just so weird, you know, so before I was, came to a more reformed understanding, a Calvinistic understanding, I was like full blown Bethel Church, Todd White kind of guy. I wanted to go make people's legs grow and see angel dust, or maybe not angel
gold
dust,
teeth and all that.
Gold dust.
Yeah, gold.
And angel feathers, which happens to be strange because angels don't actually have feathers, but it's another topic.
They're part bird.
Yeah. Where was I going? Oh yeah. So when I used to be Arminian, or at least I wouldn't say like a fully orbed understanding what even that meant, but just taking a libertarian stance of free will. People would walk me through all these texts, and I'd always, obviously it's not in the text, but my answer to them always was, yeah, but like I'd always add the condition, but you can forfeit this, or you can do that, or you can thwart this if you do. And it was always adding something to what the text was actually saying.
Yeah.
And like eventually I realized that because somebody stumped me on, John chapter 6, and he's like, is that what it says? Does it say, it says, no wise will you be cast out? Does it say that you can actually cast yourself out? It's like, no, but, and he's like, no, don't stop putting conditions on it, because that's not what it's saying. Right. And it's just like plain reading of the text that eventually led me to just like, yeah, it's right there. And I realized I was unwilling to accept it because it wasn't the kind of God that I liked or wanted to worship at the time.
Right.
Later the Lord changed my heart, but like that was why I rejected it. Ultimately, I saw it everywhere. I just despised it.
Yeah.
I remember I read all the book of Romans, highlighting everything, like Romans 9, Romans 8. There's just like hardly anything highlighted. And that was before I even saw the meme with the Sharpie where it just like crosses out Romans 9,
Yeah.
But like, so I understand the struggle of, and the struggle really came down to this not really understanding what was going on, usually there's always caricatures of certain positions, and sometimes it just needs some time to work through it. And I think even a lot of the stuff you're saying has been really helpful for me, because I haven't really understood the philosophical side of all this. I've kind of understood more of your like theological take on it, like how James White would kind of go about it and stuff, but he doesn't really, obviously he knows some philosophy, or he wouldn't be able to really teach well, but like, well, it's debatable anyway. I'm not going to get into that, but but it's super helpful to see it in the terms that you're bringing about and showing how there is actually these inconsistencies, and the consistency of the reform view is just like, we're just going with what's going on. Like, we
Yeah.
don't have to create all these like trans total depravity or whatever that stuff you're mentioning,
Yeah.
like this almost like this AI world. Like, what are we playing, punk or
Yeah,
like a punk
well,
game or
and that that comes up when you start talking about like the problem of the unevangelized, right?
Yeah.
God wants all people to be saved. What do you do with the Mayans alive at the time of Jesus, right?
Yeah.
You know, the Mayans predated Jesus, but the Mayans and people alive in that area during the time of Jesus. What do you do with that, right? God wants all people to be saved. Well, now they have to break. Okay, well, God took all these people who are trans world depraved. That is, they would never, they're trans world damnation. They never would have been, they never would have believed in any possible world. And he put all those people there, right?
Yeah.
So even though he desired them to be saved, he knew that he had kind of loaded it, like he loaded the deck with all these people who have never believed in any possible world, right?
Yeah.
So you start inventing these things, right? Which it's just, not only is it just like none of that's in there, but it's also just a thoroughly unbiblical anthropology. Like we're like there's this little like bank of like souls, right? that God can just like move anywhere throughout history and all this kind of stuff. Like it's like, I mean, we're not Jehovah's Witnesses, right? So when God creates me, he creates me, right? So I it's just it just gets so bizarre. It just gets so weird.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, is there anything you wanted to add to the Molinist perspective? Anything else you wanted to kind of attack at it or point holes at? Or
Oh, I mean, I could do this for days.
yeah.
I would just recommend anyone, if you go to the blog, freedthinkerpodcast.blogspot.com, I have a whole, I started having so many articles and blogs on different topics. I started doing like collections where everything is listed on one. So I have a whole Reformed theology collection and I have a whole Molinism collection. I recommend looking at those for more information on the nature of the will and Molinism and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. How many are part of your collection in there, would you say?
I think it's something like 30 or so in the Molinism collection, and I think almost 50 in the Reformed theology collection.
Gotcha. Cool. And then have you, so on Amazon, I saw that you're on there.
Yeah.
Did you write a book, or is that like what is that?
I did. So I have a book called Measuring McAfee. It is a book length response to a book put out by a new atheist named David McAfee. He wrote a book called Disproving Christianity. And back in 2015, I wrote basically a book length review of it because I originally started writing as just like a small review, and it just grew and grew and grew. But I found that he gave so many examples of why the new atheism is so irrational that it was just an opportunity to kind of address a whole host of things. Yeah. So it turned into a book called Measuring McAfee.
How many pages are in that? About
I think like 300.
Jeez, yeah. It'd be like Vern Poythress pumping out 1,000-page books every half a year or something out there.
No, it's the only book I've ever published. Although I have a bunch of other books that I have like partial starts on and stuff like that. So
any sneak peek previews of what the descriptions of those might be?
I have one on Reformed soteriology, system of Calvinism, and dealing a lot with what we talked about today, but going through tulip, but with an eye towards like doing it in a theologically robust way and dealing with these types of objections and all of that within that context. So I have that one. I have one on what I was here talking to you before about, Genesis 1.
Yeah.
And kind of a redemptive historical or grammatical historical reading of Genesis 1 within its ancient Near Eastern context. And then I actually have a kind of a dystopian novel that I've started, but I don't know if I'll ever finish it. I don't know if I'll ever get there, but
yeah, well, maybe you can add some of them soul chambers and
well, it's a dystopian novel that's actually supposed to be kind of a scathing analogy of the abortion industry. So
oh, there you go.
Yeah.
They need that.
Yeah.
Yeah. How about was it dang it, what was I gonna say? Um in your so okay, never mind. I think I might have lost it. I don't know.
It's all right. Do it all the time.
It happens all the time. That's what
I,
happens.
I normally say I saw a meme once that I say that my train of thought has crashed and there's no survivors.
Yeah, that's what just happened. But it was a good question, dang it. Yeah. Oh well. So here we go. This is a new one. This isn't my original one, but at least it's something, so it's not cringe. What what are some books you'd recommend on this particular topic of Molinism? Maybe for people that want to read more about this and kind of get in the literature.
Yeah, there's actually a good book put out. I can't remember the editor of it. It's called Calvinism and Middle Knowledge, and it's like a collection of essays put out. And maybe it's edited by Paul Helm. I could be totally blanking.
Is it published by Christian Focus Publishing? Is it part of that series of like the?
No, it's like a gray. It's like a gray book.
Because he wrote
I think
one called.
I think I actually have it. Hold on.
I'm thinking of the one. I think it's Reforming the Will. It's part of that one series that a bunch of other guys were involved with.
Hold on. I'm gonna go to the other room and grab it. Hold
Yeah.
on.
All right.
All right, so you're going to be my video evidence that I'm not just like claiming books that I haven't read. So you're thinking "Reforming the Will" by Paul
That's
Helm.
what I was thinking of. Yep.
In the Mentor series. That's a good one on kind of reformed views of compatibilism. There's Preciado's book "Reformed View of Freedom."
I tried to get him to come on my show, but he's pretty busy.
It's a really good book, but this is the one I'm talking about. It's edited by Lang, McGregor, and Welty. So it's Calvinism and Middle Knowledge in a Conversation.
Okay.
And it's just a collection of essays.
Great. Yeah. Doesn't James Anderson do some work with Welty, right?
Yeah, James Anderson and Welty have done some work together on Molinism. I think James Anderson. I don't know if he can. It doesn't look like he contributes to this one. Guillaume Bignon is in here. William Lane Craig, Paul Helm, Kenneth Keithley, Kirk McGregor, who is the one that I said, like, big Molinists are now saying there's gratuitous evil. I mean, he's a contributor on here. Bruce Ware, Greg Welty. So yeah, so it's a really there's a bunch of really helpful books, but Calvinism and Middle Knowledge, I think, is one of the biggest ones that have come out recently in interaction between reformed thought and middle knowledge and Molinism.
Great. Yeah, I'll try to add those in the description for anybody that wants to maybe pick up some of those books. Yeah, I haven't thought about this topic in a long time. I've been kind of in the apologetic season of my life where I'm learning a lot about Van Til and some of those guys, but it's led me to possibly, my wife is pregnant, and so that's new news to all the listeners. But
congratulations.
Yeah, thanks, man. But I think I've possibly convinced her to name, if we have a boy, Voss.
Yeah.
After Jahardis Voss.
Are you gonna like make it like cool and hipster where it's like VAUGHZ?
Yes.
With like a silent P at the beginning.
Yeah, I was thinking more like just like how the water company brand is just like VOS, not two S's, just one. But
yeah.
I just thought, what a solid name. All my other names, my wife was kind of like Machin. I don't know. All my names happen to be Presbyterian ideas, but so I'm pretty hyped about that because Voss is great. So I just remembered. Do you have to go?
No.
Okay, one more question, and we can keep talking. But it was when you mentioned the historical, grammatical method of hermeneutics, and then you mentioned redemptive historical. Mm-hmm. Isn't there a difference there? Like I know, like Richard, like I know there's this 5 views book on hermeneutics, and I think it was edited by Stanley Porter, a New
Probably.
Testament, yeah, New Testament guy, and it had Craig Blom, is it Blomberg?
Blomberg, yeah.
Blomberg, Richard Gaffin Jr. And I didn't even know there was a difference there. Do you know anything about that? I'm kind of curious, like what
The difference between historical grammatical and redemptive historical.
yeah, and then which one you
Yeah, so those aren't actually going to be competing views, right?
Okay.
So historical grammatical basically says when we interpret a passage, we take in 2 data points, right? So the data points we bring in are the historical grammatical, right? The historical context, the what's called the Germans called the Sitzenleben, the situation in life, right? So it's your historical context, your cultural context, theological context, linguistic context, right? It's all that kind of stuff that the original writer writing to his original audience would have understood within their Sitzenleben. So you have historical grammatical, and then it's just what the text says, right? The grammar of it, the syntax of it, the lexicology, all that kind of stuff. Historical grammatical, that's the 2 data points. Redemptive historical is kind of the like, if you think of it as like, if you think of historical grammatical as kind of like the foundation for the house, and the redemptive historical is kind of the roof of the house, right? A redemptive historical says we're going to read these passages in theology in their place in redemptive history. So part of how we understand Exodus, it's not just the data of the Sitzenleben of Moses and the Sitzenleben of the time in Egypt. It's not just the grammar of the text. We also want to understand it within the broader context of the redemptive narrative between the garden and the second coming, right? Between the garden and the eschaton. Where are we in that redemptive historical timeline? How does that impact what God is doing at that time, right? So it's kind of like the higher order, the second order of understanding of what's happening in the text, a little bit more theologizing. They don't actually conflict with each other.
Okay. Yeah, then I just had the wrong impression based upon that book, that one book that came out. And I guess it was really just highlighting the different particular points that they're trying to stress, not so much there's a radical difference or something like that. Because I've always seen redemptive historical kind of like how to understand God's unfolding, redemptive story. And I'm just so appreciative of the redemptive historical understanding of scripture, because before I understood things like that, I remember reading the Old Testament and I just was like, oh, do this and this will happen. I never understood, I never contextualized what I was reading in progressive revelation. I just always thought it like meant something special, particularly to me. Like like read something weird in Ezekiel and you think God's talking to you about something you're doing in your life, and the vision is actually about you personally. Or it's
an important check and balance, right? I mean, you have to have both those things. But like using a redemptive historical approach, like when people say like, oh, well, we don't use the Old Testament to interpret the New Testament. Nonsense. We do it all the time, right? So like, yes, we do. We do it all the time, right?
Yeah.
Don't say, stop. Anyone in the audience who says that type of thing, stop saying dumb things like that. We do it all the time. How do we understand, Jesus as the scapegoat? We read Leviticus 16, right? We understand what's happening in Leviticus 16. We look at what Jesus is doing, right? In another sense, we understand what's happening in Leviticus 16 in light of what's happening with Jesus, right? It's just, it depends on what you're talking about, right? So it's just wrong to say you don't ever interpret the New Testament in light of the Old Testament. Nonsense. We do it all the time.
Yeah.
But when we're reading the Old Testament, we read about David as king, right? What comes first? Do we understand Christ as the king, and so therefore we understand David as king? Or do we understand what the Davidic kingdom was and the promise of David, so we understand Christ? Yes, we do both of those, but that's a redemptive historical question. Where are we situated in redemptive history to understand David in the broader context, but also how does David in the specific context influence the broader context, right? So, it's a two-way street. It's a good check and balance. It helps keep away from kind of those crass ideas of, well, people in the Old Testament were saved by law keeping, and people in the New Testament by abandoning the law, right?
Yeah.
Well, both of those are no, right?
Yeah.
We don't do that because we have a healthy redemptive historical approach.
Right. That's a good thing about why all listeners should become Presbyterian, because we actually say, hey, what the New Testament gives, makes obsolete, we are like, yeah, sure, we're going to go with that. But if it doesn't mention anything that isn't obsolete, we're going to continue on with it.
Well, even if it's obsolete, we might still do it by general equity. So
exactly.
It's just yeah.
I have a New Covenant or progressive covenantalism buddy, good guy, and got to talk to him about some stuff. Real charity, just back and forth explaining our views. But it amazes me, not that my friend did this, but it amazes me how often Presbyterian ideas, the caricatures of them are. I mean, I remember telling a few people, hey, I'm Presbyterian now. Oh, you believe in baptism and regeneration? It's like, nope, not even close. Yeah. Just want to give the sign,
I mean, when I've dealt with my New Covenant theology friends, and by the way, people listening who aren't familiar with New Covenant theology, no, we're not just believing that they believe in the theology of the New Covenant. There's a specific theological position called New Covenant theology. I've often pushed them and said, hey, can you tell me any substantive difference between your view and progressive dispensationalism? No, you can't. I mean, if you're basically progressive dispensationalist minus the eschatology.
Yeah.
So I point that out, and then I always, I have fun asking them, because they say, well, the law, you were not under the law, we're under the law of Christ, and it's different. There's all this kind of stuff, and I always point out, well, I mean, one of the guarantees of the New Covenant explicitly in Jeremiah 31 and other places is that God's law will be written on our heart. Like it's just explicit that the law of God, not the law of Christ, the law of God, right, will be written on our hearts.
Like
that just law is one of the ways the New Covenant is fulfilled, right? So how is it that the law has been done away with completely in every sense, and yet what the New Covenant is just is that the law will be written on our hearts? So I could never, even if I left Presbyterian, I could never get down with New Covenant theology.
Yeah. It's because he mentioned too that they would see what's abrogated or kind of done away with is like all three forms, the moral, ceremonial, and civil is all done away with the law of Christ, correct? I mean, that's how you explain it to me. Yeah.
They deny the distinction.
Yeah.
Right. They're going to say, well, I just deny that threefold distinction. I don't think there is civil, ceremonial, and moral, right? You need to prove that from the scriptures, which I think we can. But they're going to say when Jesus did away with the law, he just did away with the law. They didn't, there's not this threefold distinction.
Yeah, that's because ceremonial and civil are like kind of circumstantial things. Like they're playing out in a context of a situation with Israel. The moral law, though, that just is part of God's character. That's, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, the funny thing is like, they'll say, oh, we obey the law of Christ. And I'm like, okay, but like, what did Christ say that his law was? Right. The summary of the old law. How do you summarize the law and the prophets? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. That's not a new law. Jesus wasn't saying this is a new law. He's saying that just is the old commandments, how they're summarized, right? So it's I don't know. I could never get down with New Covenant theology.
Yeah, I flirted with it before I became Presbyterian, or actually before I even knew about Presbyterian in its utmost sense, because before I got introduced to Presbyterian theology and covenant theology specifically, I was kind of like, your Mark Driscoll, Matt Chandler, kind of gospel-centered, evangeli kind of style stuff,
Yeah.
So, yeah. All right, dog. Well, we could rant on and on. I know you have you're doing another show later, right?
In like 10 minutes, I think.
Yeah. So we'll give you some time to maybe go get coffee or something. But yeah, this is a great time, man. It'd be great to have you come on again, talk some more stuff.
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
Seems like you have all kinds of different things that are plausible and possible to talk about. So I know Nick misses you. Nick was really sad he couldn't come. He really likes you a lot, and I kept messing with him because I said, "Oh, can you come on at 10?" He's like, "No, I can't." I was like, 9. He's like, "No." I was like, 8. No. And I just kept changing it by the hour. He's like, "I just
Yeah,
can't do it today." But he really told me he couldn't do it today, but I kept trying to wage him into coming. But so
that's all right.
he's gonna miss you. He really would have liked to sit in on this. So, but hey, I'm good that someone takes their family serious and takes the local church serious. That's a good thing.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
if you miss a
No, no,
podcast
no
for
issues
that,
there.
that's a good thing. Yeah. So
Yeah, no issues there.
but good stuff, man. All right. Well, this is Root in Revelation podcast, where we seek to make God's revelation our foundation in all of life. And until next time, God bless all the guys listening and women or girls or whatever. Take care.